everyone. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, Mark.
Happy New Year. So Mark, can you see the calendar invites now? Josh is saying that he could not.
Yeah, I could.
Okay.
I think
can everybody
the old one
else
must have expired at the end of the year because I'm going back through a bunch of mine and copying them back into my calendar again.
Yeah, I
Yes.
created the new ones this morning. Apparently I have write access to OpenSSF community calendar. So I took it upon myself to create the specification meetings for the rest of the year. So hoping everybody can see that.
Yeah, it's on the calendar.
Okay.
Yeah,
awesome.
one thing to look out for, because this happened with the pooling meeting, is check to see if the specification notes actually allow updates. We had an issue where the Google Doc got locked.
I just edited it today.
Oh, okay. Never mind.
Speaking of which, everyone, if you could please mark your attendance in the Google Doc, which I just shared a link to. And a reminder that attending here in this meeting is agreement to abide by the Linux Foundation Code of Conduct. Why don't we just get started? Because usually most folks show up pretty much on time. I think Melba had the first topic.
I do. So this is something that it was, I think, the last supply chain integrity working group meeting and the last SLSA meeting of the year that I brought up. And I think for the folks that were on those meetings, they had agreement about it. And so I wanted to make sure that all the SLSA SIGs were also included in this conversation. Essentially, what I've noticed in 2022 is that there's a lot of work being done, good work being done, but not everybody's talking to each other and not everybody's going towards the same vision. And so I recommended for the supply chain integrity working group to create that vision for 2023 so that SLSA, Fresca, S2C2F, they're all working towards a common goal. And so in the next supply chain integrity working group meeting, I'll bring it up again. I know Isaac already started doing a draft on what the charter is for supply chain integrity. What are we actually driving towards? And then that will set the priorities. And then once that happens, then obviously us at SLSA, we have to figure out, and the SIGs, how do we better communicate? What we were seeing in the positioning working group is we would be writing a developer blog on the SLSA 1 spec, and then we're almost done, and then we find out that something was changed, fundamentally changed in the middle of that, and now we have to go back and change it. So I would like tighter alignment between at least the SIG leads and making sure that we have representation across each of the meetings. So for example, I joined this meeting a lot of times, but if I can't, I should probably get Bruno or somebody else that regularly joins the positioning group to join this meeting, the same as tooling or tooling and spec join the positioning, so that way we know what we're working towards. Outside of that, we could potentially use the a SIG lead meeting as an example, just to say, okay, this is what we're doing. But I think we could get a lot more done and have more alignment if we work this way.
So one thing, so yeah, I largely agree. I do think that we just need to figure out how to make sure that we do it efficiently. I think folks are going to say, hey, if we start to have more and more meetings, it's gonna, especially given that I know at least from the intent, the SLSA community meeting, the first whatever it is, 15 minutes of it is supposed to be around like essentially ensuring that that stuff is aligned. But I do think that there's ways we can do that. Also, one thing to probably I want to make sure that we do also, it's something that folks are aware of is just also the 2023 TAC and governing board alignment for the OpenSSF in general, because we want to make sure that not only is within the supply chain integrity working group that we're all aligned, but that generally at the higher level that we're all in line with the broader OpenSSF goals.
Yes, I put this link to Isaac and the supply chain integrity working group to say, hey, this will help with our conversations for supply chain integrity to make sure that we're also aligned with the TAC. So yes, good thought. Positioning meeting. Oh, and I was thinking about doing a re-poll for the positioning meeting. So I don't mind starting that. Right now it is late. I think that's what was voted on, but the audience has changed or the participants have changed, so we can revisit that that meeting and when it happens.
Was there, because I know there's periodically talk about merging that with the supply chain integrity positioning. Any update on that?
No, I suspect we'll probably talk about that in the next meeting when we talk about charters and priorities and how the three align, but nothing as of yet. Yeah, I will say that in the last meeting, in line with the, trying to be one, as a positioning group, we're trying to create topics for SLSA, for OpenSSF, Open Source Summit North America, for us as SIG leads or major participants to talk about SLSA. We have one for SLSA level 1 draft or level 1 if it gets published. And there's some other ones that we took note of to say, okay, Mark and Josh could talk about this, right? And in terms of like tooling, Mike Lieberman and somebody else could talk about this. So we're even trying to get a sense of, okay, for conferences as a SLSA group, we can talk about these different topics. We can submit it under, one person, but submit it as a SLSA specification group or SLSA positioning group. It's not a person, it's the group leaders that are talking about it.
Something to think about there. And I don't know exactly if Open Source Summit is going to do this, because I know as it's growing, it probably will start to. Like at least for the OpenSSF related stuff, like they might do something that's similar to what we do in the CNCF, where the CNCF has maintainer, like they have stuff that's, times and stuff associated with projects that are underneath that org. So you can imagine it for the in line with what the OpenSSF might have just generally for in their own schedule, like they'll be allotted a certain amount of time, whether it's part of the co-located event or whatever. And so that might just be something that you don't necessarily need to submit directly and get sort of approved. To be clear, I think that it's still obviously worthwhile to push folks to submit talks about SLSA and related to SLSA, but it's probably also worthwhile to make sure that from the OpenSSF side and just the LF in general, that we have the ability to say, hey, look, we want, as an official, officially saying this is SLSA's stance on a thing. The SLSA group wants to give a talk about the state of positioning, about the state of tooling and so on.
Good thought. Thank you.
Sounds good. Thanks, Momo. Yeah, just let me know if you need anything from me or from anyone else. I think the assumption is that we'll wait to hear from you or others. But yeah, just let us know. Okay, so the second topic, I want to talk about the 1.0 release schedule, which we're like 6 months behind. We'd wanted to release it back last year, in the middle of last year. It's now the beginning of 2023. There's a strong desire to have a 1.0 release like sooner rather than later. So I think we're at the point where we've kind of agreed on the basic concepts. We're close to having all the core content there. It just needs some, well, there's a couple major gaps mentioned, which I'll talk about in a second. But then otherwise, the main concepts are there, and we could start getting review on those and agreement on those. And then we could start from there, move towards more editorial changes of making sure it's clear and we've covered all of the edge cases, et cetera. And so if we're looking to release, say, end of February, where like we actually mark it as stable at the end of February, my view has always been that I want like at least like a 4-week public review period. So that means that we need to get it by the beginning of February. And if we do that, then I think working backwards, we probably need to have the 3 major missing pieces merged, like have an initial review and merge by the end of this week. And I think those 3 major missing pieces are, one is the provenance spec, which there's an open pull request out for. Originally, we talked about splitting it out, but in the current design, we effectively delegate from the spec to the provenance in the requirements instead of duplicating content. And the other is artifact verification and system verification. Joshua and Chris, respectively, have volunteered to author the initial draft. And I know there's been some amount of work there. And then I think all of this is optimistic, but if we are able to get those pull requests, have an initial review and merge this week, we then have the kind of the core content there, and well, maybe there's like outstanding to-dos and things like that. Then we could spend the rest of the month kind of going through them in a prioritized order, eliminate all of the to-dos, do the highest priority issues, make sure they're resolved, and like the clarity things that we wanted out of 1.0, that we actually get them out of 1.0. And then at the beginning of February, like end of January, beginning of February, that week, announce to the community that it's ready for review. And during that period in February, we could continue to make further clarity changes. But we basically, ideally, would have all of the actual content, terminology, et cetera, kind of solidified by then. And there wouldn't be too major of changes during February. And then after the 1.0 release, I think we could continue to edit to, like we have done with the original release, address edge cases, address inconsistencies, clarity, et cetera. But just don't change like the significant meaning. So, okay, Michael.
Yeah, the only thing I just wanted to add in there is something that we wanted to, from the tooling side, wanted to get some feedback on. Did you think that we could, like, do you think by and large the spec will probably be accepted as is, or with like relatively minor changes? Because I think from the tooling side, we're starting to think of like, hey, we want to be ready so that when 1.0 comes out, it's not going to be like 2 months before anything supports the 1.0 spec. We want to make sure that it's like, you know, even if we adopt, let's say, hey, we've adopted the draft, and then once, you know, if there's a couple of naming changes and a couple of small things, it shouldn't be massive PRs there, except to maybe a couple of the tools that do have longer release cycles.
Yeah, that's a good point that I completely missed. We should absolutely, in my opinion, we should tie this to tooling, because like we won't know if the spec is good until you go to implement it, right? Like you spend all this work thinking it's perfect, and the first time you go to like, oh crap, I just forgot this case, or like it's not implementable. Do you think that right, and same for blog and position. I think it should be aligned. It's not just like spec by itself. I kind of had tunnel vision when I wrote this. Do you think, okay, so first of all, I guess considering that, that, you know, we want to get like tooling and communication and everything aligned, is this even a realistic timeline, I guess, first of all? Or are we deluding ourselves?
I think it depends on how you define it and what line in the sand we as a group are sort of taking, right? Because I mean, and this is not I can't remember the thing that they say about, these sorts of things, but it's like, if you say, hey, there's a 4-week, let's say, period that we'll take feedback, a ton of folks are going to give feedback literally 4 weeks from now, all of a sudden, and then you're going to be like, oh, okay, because that's just the way these things work. But I think if we, say, hey, look, we're looking for feedback, and that feedback is going to be voted on by the steering committee of SLSA, right? Then that just sort of says, yeah, like your feedback might be good, but we might still say it's not really what we're looking to change.
So yeah, I guess I think we can really gauge it pretty well by just kind of understanding what's the rest of the work needed for 46 and 508, right? Because Mark, you're saying that 525 is pretty much ready for review. I feel like that's kind of the biggest hurdle, and then the rest is just review and tweaking based on review, right?
Yeah, yeah, I think Chris is here, right? I think I saw his name.
Yeah, Chris is here. I can speak quickly to 46 while Chris is coming off mute and say, I have content for the terminology page that I'm planning to submit as a draft PR maybe today, and then I'm still working on what the changes in the requirements are to reflect that kind of terminology and those concepts. So I think this week is a reasonable goal for having the content authored, but review may be trickier within that time frame. The other thing I wanted to suggest is that actually no, I'll let Chris speak first. I'll keep my hand raised for the second point.
The reviewing systems docket is in about the same place. I have it as a Google Doc. It still has some outstanding feedback that I need to address, but I can have it as a PR today or tomorrow. It's just a matter of whether it's approved by the end of the week.
All right, so then maybe just to set up like intermediate milestones for us to try to, time box efforts. If we say get them out for review by the end of this week, so like 46 and 508 out for review by, and like merge next week. Monday I think is too tight turnaround. But ideally, get reviews early in the week and be able to address feedback. So effectively the January 20th, like hopefully have everything, an initial draft. Even if there's outstanding to-dos, I think it's probably worthwhile at this point to, if there's a particular tricky thing, like, oh, I'm not sure how to resolve that, that's going to take a lot of thinking to do. Put it as a to-do, submit it in the markdown as a to-do. That's what I've been doing. And then we can come back to it later. And then when we're getting closer to the end of the month and we have a bunch of these, we could prioritize and say, which ones do we really need to address? Which ones can we defer? Which ones can we just say it's good enough? Okay. You both have your hand up, by the way.
Yeah, I did have a follow-on kind of suggestion, which is, I don't know how attached we are to the proposed February date, but we could, thinking of this more like traditionally developed software, we could think of the February date, or we could think of the review period closing as when the beta period starts, and then we integrate the outstanding review while any tooling is progressing during that period. So the spec is kind of more complete, but not then. Once the beta period is over, feedback's integrated and tooling's ready, that's when we make the release with the blog post and the positioning updates and things. I don't know how well that would work, but it's just an idea that I thought was worth airing.
Yeah, I really like that idea, especially for some of the simpler tools that can very easily integrate both a draft or a beta and then eventually the real thing. I think some of the tools are going to say, hey, look, given our release cycle, it probably really only makes sense for us to implement the full 1.0. But I think a lot of other tools are going to say, you know, like I'm just thinking of all the GitHub generator stuff that we just have for SLSA. It'll take somebody a couple of hours to implement and then, you know, can go out in a day or two. Whereas certain other things, like I'm just thinking Tecton has actual release cadences and that could take a while. But I do love that.
Yeah, I think we should define which tools we care about or have sufficient control over to include in that kind of time boxing effort, right? We have two demo repositories and then two like non-demo repositories in the SLSA framework organization. There's the Jenkins generator and the GitHub generators that are not demos. Whether we want to try and reach out to the maintainers of those tools and see how they fit in with this proposal.
Yeah, I see the kind of the major the verifying, like the three, I think, major pieces here are the provenance format, which is the most direct where we would get the feedback. It's like we got a lot of feedback so far. Hopefully the new thing is clear, but it's not clear. Maybe it's either a side step or a backward step. I hope it's better. The artifact verification piece probably is the most underdeveloped because we don't really have a good story so far on that. Like the only tool, there's some like ad hoc verification things, like implementing a queue, etc. The SLSA verifier thing has stuff on the command line, but it's not really integrated in a way that we're hoping for the 1.0 of, like, you know, there's like conventions and expectations and things like that. So that's probably, but doing that in time for 1.0 is going to be tough. So I'm not sure what it would be good to think about, like if we have like some sort of prototype or something like that for that. I think that one is less clear to me. And then for verifying systems, I'm less concerned about that because that's kind of like an offline process anyway. And you could kind of initially, you could just kind of fake it with, here's the key that I trust. And that's that.
So if I may interject here, I mean, one question I have is, you know, what is essentially the criteria to decide, okay, we're ready to call it 1.0 and be done? Because, you know, if it's just, well, we don't have any open issues on GitHub, that's one way to do it, or we don't have any Git pull request open, that's some different criteria. But if you say, hey, we want at least some number of people reporting they have actually implemented it, whatever that means, you know, that's different criteria. If you look into how standards get developed nowadays, they often have pretty stringent criteria, even going as far as an interop, you know, criteria where they actually test that different implementations do the same things. And I'm not saying we want to do all of this because clearly this would push way beyond what you're hoping to do. And I think it's reasonable for a first version not to have very high expectation in this regard. But I still think it'd be good to have, at least among ourselves, some kind of defined criteria of where we set the bar.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I think the bar is that we have achieved the things we set out to achieve in the proposal, or at least enough of them, right? That was they were the goals we set out with for the 1.0 release, or release. Who decides whether we've met those goals or enough of them is a good question. I think it looks like Mark has something to say, but I think it's probably some combination of maintainers and steering committee. But I'll let Mark speak.
Yeah, I struggle with this because my inclination would be to err on the side of being more confident and wait for implementations, but then that's kind of what we've been doing all along, and it just kind of drags on. If we could have a couple implementation, well, I guess maybe I don't have a hard idea of like, if you do X, it's good. My inclination would be something like we consensus of, this group, and also steering committee, something like that. And if we kind of agree, if it feels right, that's kind of begging the question now. What I would feel comfortable with is if we had at least a couple implementations, do a draft version and say they've done it, it's working. Without that, I wouldn't be very confident. And then I think we'll have, if the implementations aren't there and it's kind of coming towards end of February, my inclination would be to just extend the review period and just have a longer in review, because then it's basically, it's out there, people could look at it. We don't know of things that we're going to change, but there's some indication that, we might see issues and it might change before we call it stable. What do you think, Arno?
Yeah, I think something like this sounds reasonable to me. There's also a corollary to this, which is what's your, tolerance to having to do a 1.1 pretty quickly because you messed up something and you say, oof, we have a problem here, we need to fix, is that tolerable or not? Some people might have different expectation in this regard. If you're more tolerant, then you can take a higher risk and say, okay, we're not necessarily, maybe we are missing something, but it's good enough to call it 1.0 and get going, right? I mean, for background, what you just said, if you look at the way the RTC does it, before they call it a standard, what they call standard, which is a recommendation, they have this candidate recommendation, which actually has no time limit. It's like, well, we need at least 2 implementation of every feature in the spec. And it takes whatever it takes. And I'm not saying this is what you want to do here. Again, I'm not trying to push a specific model. I'm sharing this as food for thoughts. This is the kind of stuff that gets done. And it all depends on, what your threshold is, tolerance with risk of messing it up and having to revise and whatnot.
Yeah, that's a good question. Maybe we should get more feedback on this from the community of how desirable is it to have something called 1.0 now that's marked as stable with some high amount of risk that you're going to have to do a 1.1 or 1.2 in not that long, or how much would people want to wait for a, like a really stable 1.0. I guess that's kind of why the Linux kernel, in the old days or some other software would have like odd numbers are experimental and even numbers are stable or whatever. I don't know how to communicate that.
Yeah, no, but that's exactly the kind of thought and so the other thing I will share, and this is kind of gut feeling to me, is like, the reality we are in today is there are already people claiming compliance with SLSA. So from that point of view, we can't really do worse. You know, if we had a 1.0 that's kind of, you know, flawed in some ways, maybe it's still a step in the right direction. And so from that point of view, the sooner the better. But maybe we shouldn't shoot too high.
Yeah, Vita.
Yeah, I just for the sake of expediency, I think we have to compromise a little and say if enough of the spec has been implemented, not all of it, not multiple times, but if enough of the spec has been implemented that we have confidence, that should be sufficient. Because full coverage is a thing. That's a lot of work.
So I wanted to echo some of that, where I feel if we release the parts, only the parts that we're truly confident in. I think I mentioned this when we first started this. Level 1, level 2, right? Forget about level 3, level 4, because if you don't have that solid base, it doesn't matter what you do in level 3, level 4, it's going to constantly change. So if we're super confident on level 1, okay, that's going to go into version 1. Level 2, are we confident in that? Okay, that's going to go into version 1. If only a subset of level 3 is ready, then we may not want to put that in the 1.0 as much as we'd like. We can say level 3 is in draft, but it's not stable. At least that's my inclination, because you don't want to lose the community's confidence in SLSA and in us as a community if you're constantly changing things and pulling the rug from under them. Some people have already gone through this process, even though it wasn't well defined, but we don't want to make people do extra work because we are constantly changing level 1 or level 2 as an example, which is pretty much the foundation.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, and I also think that, you know, there's some things that from a I think a lot of that's also going to be part of, you know, blog articles and some of the education, making sure that folks understand, because without getting into too many details, there's definitely I think all of us have found our fair share of either blog articles or YouTube videos of someone saying, here's how we did all this stuff with SLSA, and it's clear to the folks who are in this meeting that like, not really. And I know with some of the SLSA conformance work that some folks are working on, you know, there might be some additional stuff where we might come in and actually say, hey, look, you can't claim to be SLSA compliant and use the OpenSSF's trademarks unless you at least provide this level of stuff there. But I think to your point, like we want to make sure that that's crystal clear, because the worst that could happen is you know, if even among this group there's a lot of like, well, sort of they comply, and it's like, yeah, that's gonna kill any sort of emerging standard or whatever you want to call it.
So to Melville's point, any thoughts on what we are confident in versus what we're not? Like the levels 1, 2 versus 3 would be a clear thing to delineate, but is that like, are the things in level 3 that's right now, for example, here I'll link to the requirements in the chat, just so people can click. Is there anything in level 3? Like chopping out level 3, for example, would it increase our confidence very much? It's not obvious to me, one way or the other. It's basically the non-forgeable piece and the ephemeral and isolated piece. I think that's the only major, well, I guess that and the verifying systems. We had talked about, and I don't know if there's agreement, but we had talked about the idea that like at level 2, to call something level 2, you just have to say, well, I believe it to be a service, and that's that stamp. Like there's pretty much a low bar to call it that. Whereas to certify something at level 3, there's a lot more process involved. That would be something that we could defer. Yeah, Aaron?
My opinion, we have to launch 1.0 with level 3 with these factors, because if we only launch 1.0 with 2 levels, the second level is nice, but it's not very strong. So I think we have to go with 3. So if that means delaying, I think it's worth it. Hopefully not, you know.
Is there a reason why end of February? Was that arbitrary, or is there a conference
Arbitrary.
that's in March? Okay.
No, arbitrary. Just
Okay.
just a desire, like that I keep hearing, that like lots of companies like just want, they want something, and so that was just picked.
Got it.
That was like the earliest date that I thought was even possible.
Got it. Because if there's a conference, as an example, I know the open source summit is May, but if there's something, let's say in April or in March, that we can aim towards, and then I can understand, because we would want to be ready for those conferences, as an example.
I think we should be ready for the conferences as they're coming up, but I think also one of the other reasons why we want to kind of get the 1.0 out is also to clear up some confusion caused by 0.1 and what we currently have today. I just say that like because having looked at some of the proposals for some of the talks for Cloud Native SecurityCon, some of them showed a very clear lack of understanding of SLSA, or at least the some of that, but also, we are seeing, for example, more and more folks give talks about SLSA, and obviously we would want to see talks on SLSA 1.0. For example, there is, I think, a few talks on SLSA that's going to be happening in a couple of weeks in Seattle, like Cloud Native SecurityCon. I know there's a bunch of talks that have been submitted for KubeCon Europe, which is in April. And then I know that there's upcoming, which I believe the CFP is ending sooner than we'd like, for the open source summit out in Vancouver.
That's a really good point. Like part of the 1.0 desire for 1.0 is to address those concerns. Is there any way we could reach out to some of those folks to see if the changes that we've made in 1.0 actually achieve that effect of making it more clear?
I think that there's probably, I know SUSE has done some stuff, and a few other folks have like very publicly said, hey, we're doing a lot of SLSA. I think that'd be a good idea.
Yeah, agreed. I think we could easily find at least the SUSE and Flatcar folks that have implemented SLSA and documented how they believe they've achieved the requirements.
So I know we're all aiming to have a 1.0, but would it be conceivable to have a maybe 0.9 or something like this that would we be able to publish sooner rather than later? And that would be kind of a middle ground where we're not saying, hey, it's completely ready yet, but it's way better than 0.1, which is the only thing that people have so far. And would give us a bit more time to finalize 1.0. I kind of agree with that, what Aaron said, by the way. I think a 1.0 with that level 3 is a bit weak and is going to, most people are going to say, that's all. They're going to feel let down, honestly. So from that point of view, it would be better to have a 0.9, which is maybe not perfect, and as some, that comes sooner, they're still better than 0.1, and then we take the time to finalize the 1.0 that has level 3 and is more solid.
I'll let others talk first.
So I want to agree with the sentiment that level 3 should be in 1.0, and I'm quite comfortable with level 3 as it is personally. I think we've had some recent wording changes that have made it a lot clearer. The other thing I want to say is that I worry that if we keep, like, I think we've seen a flurry of folks who are interested in this space implement SLSA, their interpretation of SLSA 0.1, and then a bunch of folks who are interested but holding off until it's more fully baked. And I don't know that an interim release helps, because yeah. So I think, I know you said earlier something along the lines of, like, you kind of need that 1.0 for people to start implementing it. And once you get that feedback, you can make updates. And you asked how we felt about making a fairly quick 1.1 or similar. So I actually think I feel that the implications of the version number is what is holding some folks back from implementing SLSA. So in some ways, we just kind of need to get to that 1.0 and make a release.
Just want to throw a middle ground to the release number. I as far as what version, it's irrelevant as long as it's usable. For me, from the release side, I heard someone mentioned earlier, we need to go out to the community and ask for feedback on things. So it almost feels like we're at a pre-version 1 release request for comment stage, which could allow us, I think I've heard a lot of people say we feel pretty confident up to 3 where there might be some changes, but it's fairly, close. So if we're close to release, why aren't we not at a pre 1.0 release out for request for comment? We can have 2 or 3 versions of pre-releases as we go through multiple stages. So it gives us whatever time you need for it, but at least we're acknowledging it's close to there. It might change based on these next few feedback loops, but we're a pre-1 release.
That aligns with the notion of calling something a beta or whatever, and then giving folks time to work on tooling and positioning and things like that as well, I think.
Go ahead, Michael.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think calling a beta release a draft or whatever is good. I think the only thing that I know we want to avoid is we want to avoid the churn of one more thing before it's ready for 1.0. I don't know if folks have thoughts around helping that, but I know from a lot of the LF related projects, one of the things that constantly has happened is a little bit of that paralysis right before a release, because something else comes up. And just, I think on that end, we just want to make sure that we can be very clear, like if we do open up a request for comment, that it ends at a very specific date and so on, because we also don't want to end up perfect is the enemy of the good. We don't want to end up in a situation where we're constantly trying to make sure that it's perfect, just as and we do want to do what we can to make sure that we get feedback. So that's also another thing that I really want to make sure gets heard, because in a lot of the OpenSSF and Linux Foundation CNCF stuff, one of the things that sometimes happens without the right communication is a lot of folks say, wait, the RFC was done, I never even heard it happened. And so all of a sudden, a lot of folks get a little grumpy that, like, they had no idea that there was this request for comment.
Yeah, I originally had an opinion, but then I now no longer have a strong opinion. I guess after that, I'd be kind of inclined to keep it, calling it 1.0, but as draft. Because effectively it's just another 0.2 and 1.0 release candidate or draft or beta or whatever, or just two names for the same thing. And 1.0 release candidate at least makes it more clear, like this is not intended to be stable, or less stable. One question, assuming that we do that, so we continue what were the current plans, possibly just extending the period that's called draft, the RFC period. Any thoughts on how we indicate that? Like, you know, we could change the URL, so it's like v1-draft, which is kind of annoying. Another option would be like have like a query parameter like $draft, or like call it our release candidate, or just have the warning banner that we have now. Any ideas, thoughts? Or it doesn't matter is a fine thought too.
I just wanted to say that it should at least be clearly, you know, URL is good, but should say clearly in the document that it is, just to be clear, just so it can't be misinterpreted.
Yeah. Sorry. I think either way we'll have such a banner, like both a thing at the top saying this is like the status field, and also the big pop-up banner that we have now. I guess more specifically in like the URL, should we call it? Should we change a URL, or is it fine leaving that URL? Let's just be one. Am I the maybe I'm the only one that like looks at URLs and like decides based on URLs?
It'd be nice if it matched. That way there's a transition. People could look at that one when we get the 1.0, and you can have prior URLs. It just shows the history too.
If you follow the principle of cool URLs don't change, yes, you should have a different URL for the draft and the final version, because you're actually changing the content underneath. But
Yeah, I think I also prefer a URL to a parameter, like a fixed URL. I think is preferable.
I guess one question is like, how much is that worth? Because it's going to take some amount of effort to implement it.
yes,
Ideally, we would have something that like automatically builds at every version and like these tags, and like you could do like down to point releases, or the V1 goes to the latest release, but it's just not implemented, so we don't have it.
so we have the version, and we are adding the status, the /stage. We should be able to get away with just those two things and keep the URL the same, and be able to live with this.
Yeah, that's my inclination. Okay, I think it's good enough.
How much dimensions do you want to have to this same problem?
So I guess to recap this, it sounds like the consensus seems to be call it 1.0, have the draft banner and like the status field saying in review, possibly changing the text of the banner to make it more clear that it's like in the RFC period and when the RFC period will end. Arna, you were gonna say something?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt because I want to slightly take back what I said. There is one important aspect to this, which is if you want to be able to go back to an older version. So if we have a 1.0 draft that's up for review, and then you have a new version or the final version, and at some point you want to say, oh, but look, in the previous, in the draft version, we had it this way or for some reason. You won't be able to do that unless you have a unique URL for the draft version.
We could point people to Git history, I guess, is it's not a great solution, but it is a solution. Yeah, I think ideally we would have that. I'm not sure, given our time period, like the amount of effort that would take away from the actual ability change the content, and between the two, I would assume editing of the content is more valuable time-wise.
I don't want to sidetrack you too much into this, but so practically speaking, it's a matter of today we encode the version in the URL, and we would have to have the status as well in the URL somehow.
Yeah, or like a minor point release, like, right. Like we would have to change how we build. Right now, what we always build, we have a directory for each major version, or either minor version, whatever, and always build it head. And so all the different versions are just different directories, and our release just always built it head. I think a theoretical better thing, I'm not sure in practice would be better, would be like to have each spec have its own repo maybe, and tag them and have some build process, pull in all the different repos, build it all the different versions and mash them together, or not mash, but like combine them together into one site. I think that's the right way to do it. I think SPDX, for example, is doing that with their site. I think William Bartholomew said something about that. That seems like a better system, but we just don't have it. And building
but
that.
maybe with subfolders, we could pull it off though. Just like we have different versions for different folders for different versions, we could have for draft and for the final of the 1.0, for instance.
Yeah, I guess you could do that. Like instead of just editing the draft continually as during the comment period,
yeah,
you could just have a permanent
every
draft.
time you want to, exactly, every time you want to kind of be able to refer back to this in history, you would have to create a new folder. All right, that is just maybe worth thinking about. We don't have to solve it now.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to assume we're not going to do that, but if you or anyone feels strongly, then I'm going to let someone else make it happen.
Yeah, so I don't feel strongly, but I do think that for folks who are interested, one of the things that's probably a point of discussion for the 1.0 tooling implementations, because right, like if there's going to be an expectation that we're using certain things in the implementation, and if the idea is that certain things might, like the certain things from a URL perspective of like, yeah, 1.0 might change, that could cause some issues. I think regardless, we're going to have a discussion in the tooling meeting.
Yeah, so for the actual like the provenance spec, it was currently in the pull request, and this is like I said for comments, is I just include like question mark draft because it's like a free way of doing it. Like the server just ignores that query parameter, and it's a super cheap way of doing it. And then anything with that, it's not documented. I guess I need to document it. Would assume like it's just a floating version and there's no guarantee about compatibility. And once we finalize, we don't support it anymore. Versus having like some version thing and then the tooling, like, do you support all these intermediate drafts or do you only support the final thing? Although I guess calling them like release candidates would maybe make that more clear. But, yeah. Okay, so we're almost out of time. So there's some notion about, some question about URLs. It would be nice to have point releases, permalinks, but so there's some question about the permalinks. Sounds like we'll call it 1.0 like release candidate. It would be good to reach out if anyone can, once we have it, in the coming weeks. If you know, like Michael mentioned, some talks, it'd be good to reach out to them and see if the new version helps. It sounds like including level 3, we'll assume we'll include level 3 for now. Although we could be on the lookout for other things that we could possibly defer. Okay, and we'll also plan to have some sort of tooling ready in the same time period. Maybe in the tooling meeting we could talk about. implementing some of the like the draft versions.
Sounds good. I can try and reach out to a couple of folks, like I've spoken to Sousa about their implementation, and Flatcar as well.
Great. Yeah, sample implementation. That sounds good. So just, I don't think we should spend time talking about it here, but I just want to call the attention to the, again, the provenance pull request. There's a bunch of to-dos in it, and like it's not written in a format. Like it's written in a protobuf, probably want to be converted to Markdown. There's a lot of things we could do for editing, but I wanted to see if the schema, here's the link. It's in the doc as well. But that the top post on that has a link to the preview that you can look at. And so if I'd be interested in feedback. I guess this is where implementations actually would be really valuable. But I think if we did, my thinking was, as long as people who read it look at it and say, yeah, that makes sense to me, we can at least submit it, mark it as draft, no, it's unstable, and then instead of implementations having to refer to a pull request, they could at least refer to something on the website. Yeah, Michael.
Yeah, I generally like it. I think the main things I know we wanted to make sure of, because it makes implementation of use of the spec simpler, is stuff like making sure that things that are intended to be like temporal or non-reproducible, those sorts of things should go into their own sort of separate, metadata section, or something like that, just because it makes it easier for folks who are comparing, two documents that just have different timestamps and be able to say, well, take me the hash of all the stuff that should be reproducible, and you could just sort of take that all out, as opposed to what some folks I've noticed been doing today is they go like field by field and say, well, these fields should be reproducible, and then try and pull that in, and it becomes a huge mess. Whereas I think this makes, at least from a draft perspective, this makes it a lot more ingestible. And I'm hoping in the tooling meeting, we can kind of have some discussions about, are there any other small tweaks we would make to this to make it even nicer to use?
Yeah, in fact, I think that's the one thing. Like the build definition is intended to be stable, and the run details is supposed to be like this ephemeral thing that changes on every invocation. I added a question in there. One big question to me is for anyone here to think about in your review. There's things like, for example, on GitHub Actions, when you invoke it, there's the build can view the GitHub context, which is like a variable that the build process can query. Has things like the actor who triggered the action, the like ID numbers of the repository, a run number, things like that are kind of a run detail, but also available. It's actually an input to the build process. So it kind of spans both. It's not exactly a parameter, but it doesn't feel right. So it doesn't fit very cleanly into any of these when I was trying to do it. So that might be something if folks have an idea on like how to tweak the model to incorporate that, or that it's okay as is.
So hey Mark, this is Gilbert. So our team has experience with GitHub Actions and collecting insights on GitHub Actions. So are you so I can understand better, are you trying to just kind of look at the volume of actions based on who created that GHA, I'll call it pipeline or workflow, and then trace back everything around it? Is that the intent?
Yeah, by the way, if anyone wants to go, we're out of time. So thanks everyone for attending. I don't want to keep people past the time. The idea is to capture basically everything that went into the build, theoretically, so you could reproduce it, although that's not the primary motivation. The primary motivation is to capture all of the things that were like externally. The number one motivation is capture all the things that were externally input, so that way you know whether like it's like a legitimate build or not. Because just because you could build the same software, but like if I create my own action, for example, or input a parameter, I could do something malicious, and that's what we're trying to catch. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. Okay, thank you. Just wanted to understand better. Thanks for clarifying.
Okay, we're 1 minute past. Thanks everyone for joining, and I'll talk to you either on comments or see you in the next meeting. Thanks everyone. Bye.